Intelligent or thoughtful use of gradients can give your layouts depth and dimension, but overuse can be the sign of a beginner or be very busy or distracting for the viewer. So we'll take a look at a few ways to add subtle gradients to this layout. I'm going to start with the top half. These are two separate frames that have been created with a solid black fill color. If I change my toolbar to the double column layout by hitting these two tiny arrows at the top left, the middle button will go to the default gradient style, which is black to white. Now, while black to white can be very effective, if this is a print piece, sometimes the white edge can taper off too quickly and vanish. If I go to the gradient panel on the right, I'm in the typography workspace, and that is built in. You could see that I'm on a linear gradient style. I could put in an angle of 90 degrees by typing 90 and hitting Return or Enter. Or if it goes the wrong direction, I could type -90 to get it to go from light to dark instead of dark to light. But I do want this dark to light. However, I'm not going to go to pure white. In fact, I'm not going to use pure black. I'm going to make this subtle to give it depth. If I double-click on the white end of the gradient, this selects that spot. And you can also use the gradient tool in InDesign. The letter G will jump you to the gradient tool. So if I click and drag, I can make a custom or sharper gradient. The longer I drag, the more shades I get. The shorter I drag, the sharper the transition. And if I hold down my Shift key, it keeps it perfectly straight. But what I'm going to do is start at the top, holding down Shift and dragging to the bottom. And I can even go well past to get this to be lighter from black to white. But in my swatches panel, I mentioned that white may make this taper off too quickly. So I'm going to add a new swatch to be able to drag in and keep a little bit of dot for ink on press. So I'll rip off swatches by grabbing the word swatches for a moment, and I'll choose New Color Swatch. And I'm going to choose 3% black. Usually any dot on press below 2 or 3% will vanish, so that truly equals white, and this will give you a smoother end to your gradient. So when I click OK, it fills the entire box with that 3% black. But if I go back to the gradient panel and click anywhere on the gradient bar, I go back to my standard black and white. If I drag and drop onto the gradient bar, I can actually add new points. And if I really only want to go from black to 3% of the black, I could rip this pure white spot completely off or out of the panel. And if I click this end and look at my color panel, I'm also going to rip off color. By ripping off the panels, you could see the values when you click on them. So here when I click this end, I see the 3%. When I click this end, I see the 100%. Or I could mix my own color for the end, making a subtler gray. For now, I'm just going to keep color up here, swatches below, so I could see all three panels at once, and I'll dock them away when I'm finished. So by using my Shift key and dragging top to bottom, I can get a lighter gray here, making a more natural or subtle gradient. I'm going to do the same thing on this bottom portion. I'll click here, hit gradient, or in fact, just my period key on my keyboard will go to gradient. And in this gradient, what I want to apply is a radial gradient behind this bottle. So I'll change the type from linear to radial, and there you see it. And if I hit the letter G or click on my gradient tool, I could actually go from the middle of the bottle out to do a highlight. But I need it to be more subtle, so I'm going to build some swatches to get a lighter gray to that 3% black. In fact, I could go to pure white on this one because the white really ends behind the bottle. So let's build our darker gray swatch. So a new color swatch, and I'll make this 60% black for a lighter gray. I'll click on the gradient bar again, and I get the radial with white to black. And this time, when I drag my lighter gray on top of the black end, it replaces it. And now I could start in the middle of the bottle and drag out, letting go over and over again in different spots until I get the highlight just where I want it. And I think I'm pretty happy with that. So if I click away with my selection tool and hit W for preview, I've got some definition in this layout. In fact, these are two separate pieces, so I could even move the entire box down or resize it to affect my highlight. Click the top box and pull that down to affect how much of the gradient I'm getting for each of these pieces. And there should be a lighter line here that I may have lost. Let's see. There it is. This is a lighter gray line, but it's fading into the background a bit. If I hit stroke, I'll see the tint is 50%, which is too close to the color of my gradient. So on stroke, or the line color, I'll make that 80%. And click away, and there I have some definition. And let's make them both match. I'll click the top line, type 80, and press Return or Enter. And if I'd like, I can nudge this down a few, because there is a drop shadow. We'll also add a gradient to the type, but again, I'm going to make it subtle. So I'll come back to my toolbar, I'll click Fill, and click Gradient. And in this case, it filled the entire box because the formatting was set for the container. I want to affect the type, not the box. So I'll choose None to get rid of the fill for the box, and then click the T to say that the formatting I choose, I want to affect the text. Now I'll choose Gradient. And again, I want to go from that 2 or 3% for the printing press of the white directly over that light end. It'll get a little bit thick black right when you get on it. There we go. You could see that you're on it when you see the hand with the plus sign, and I see a thick black edge on the inside. And then I accidentally created another point, so I'll drag that off. On this end, I'll use my same 60% black. And I'll change my angle to 90 degrees. Or I could hit G from my gradient tool and use my Shift key to drag up or drag down to control how light or how dark that gradient is. So there, I'm doing a lot more of the 3% white by going very high on this, but I get a little bit of depth in the words, the bottle. And when you do a gradient on text, sometimes it's easy to lose the edges of the text. So I'll select the text again, go to Type, so my formatting affects the type, and I'll give it a very thin stroke or outline to give it a more defined edge. So when I hit Stroke and hit black, I think the 1 point is too thick, so I'll size this down to 1/2 point. And I could even do it in the same 80% black, keeping a consistent gray color story for this piece. I'll click away and hit Command 0 or Control 0 to fit in window, and I'll finish this off by applying a color gradient to the bottle itself. When I select the bottle, I can hit period to go to a gradient. I can choose radial to give it a shine or a highlight, and then I can hit G for my gradient tool or click my gradient tool and do a small highlight here inside the bottle with longer drags for less of the color and very short, sharp drags to get a quick switch on the gradient. Now, in this case, I've resized the bottle a few times, so that highlight is going to be a little bit oval shaped. The green I used before was not added to swatches, so I'm going to hit Last Color and New Swatch so I have it to use. Then I'll click on my gradient bar and drag that green over the dark gray to replace it. And I could make a darker green on this end or a lighter green on this end instead of a white. But I'll use my gradient tool to do a very short drag, and here you can see I've almost got a highlight or a reflection on that bottle, giving it some depth. I think I'll finish this off by going to Stroke and choosing black and making it half a point so it's nice and thin, and that 80% so I get more of a gray. And here is our finished piece. We've added depth, we've kept it light and simple so you aren't getting harsh red-black gradients that are really in the viewer's face. There are 5 tips to keep in mind to make smoother gradients for print so you don't get breaks or banding. I'm going to jot those in with the type tool as a note. The first tip, if I go to my paragraph style and choose numbered list, is use a high percentage of color change. Most PostScript or high-end output devices can print 256 shades of gray. Newer devices can go beyond that, but you might not know what the print shop has on their end. So by blending from 20% of a color to 80, there are more shades in between than 40 to 60. Use lighter colors. With lighter colors, you may get breaks or banding, but they're far less obvious if I do a dark gray to a light gray. If I had done a red to a black, that break or band would be very harsh or very dark, but light gray to dark gray will be smooth and subtle. Don't cover a wide area or the whole page. If you try to spread a gradient over the entire page, all 11 inches, you have 256 shades of color to go across that 11 inches. So what I did with this design is in this roughly 5-inch high box, I did one gradient, and in this one, I had a gradient in a smaller portion of this 5-inch high box. And then the bottle itself was a different gradient, and the height of the bottle is about 4.7. So instead of going over all 11 inches with one gradient, I used smaller, more subtle gradients. Now, you may not have the option to control this, but you can actually lower the LPI, or lines per inch, of the job when you're printing. Most magazines are printed at 150 lines per inch, and if I go to my calculator, there's a magic formula. Most image setters or plate setters film devices do 2,400 spots per inch. Divided by 150 for magazine quality gives me 16, and if I square that, 16 times 16, I've reached my magic 256 shades of gray. But if I try to do a higher line screen, a higher quality job, if I do 2,400 spots per inch of the image setter or plate setter, the hardware, and I did a 175 line screen, I get 13.7 roughly. That number squared is 187 shades of gray. So a lower line screen for the job, if you have control over that, can actually give you more shades of gray and cause less banding. And then finally, if your device can do it, run the job at a higher SPI, spot per inch, also known as dots per inch, DPI. I use spots per inch as a teacher to specify hardware. Many people call image resolution DPI or dots per inch, and hardware resolution DPI or dots per inch. As a teacher, I use pixels per inch for images, photos, scans, and spots per inch to indicate hardware. But DPI you'll frequently see used as both. And this is your tour of gradients. So see if you can do gradients thoughtfully in your own work.